Hi everyone, I'm Dr.Animaction. Welcome, after many false starts, to the third episode of my Hanna-Barbera Studio Retrospective, where we'll be moving into history's most awesome decade, the 1980s. I can't say for sure, since I'm just starting on the script, but we may be able to get all the way through 1996, which is when the studio officially became a subsidiary of Warner Brothers. I mean, sure, I'll know by the end of the script how far we actually made it, but I also know me, and I'll either be too lazy to come back here and update the intro, or I'll space it out and forget about it entirely. Either way, it'll be a surprise for all of us. As this is my first big video in a while, it's going to be my gateway video back into frequent releases, so definitely keep an eye on the channel for some hopefully exciting goodies to come. Now though, let's see what the 80s and 90s held for Hanna-Barbera. Well, the studio didn't exactly start off the decade with a bang, as instead of bringing us many new shows, they instead recycled a good deal of old and licensed content. This may be because a number of their shows from 1979 didn't make it past a single season, and they wanted to shift focus to more of their known commodities. It could also have been because Joe had become more interested in live-action series. I guess it could also be because their relatively new Australian division saw their workload tapering off with the fizzling out of the famous Classic Tales series. Honestly, I don't know why their output was relatively stale this year, which is a researcher's favorite thing to admit. As anyone who has watched my animated 80s series knows though, 1980 was kind of a slow start to the decade across the board. Of the 7 new series the studio premiered here at the front end of the decade, there were only 2 new IPs, one of which was a live-action puppet series called the C.C. Beagle Show, which never made it past the pilot. The other was some very old characters fit into the classic mystery-solving teen model Hanna-Barbera had become synonymous with in the 1970s, but at least the Drac Pack lasted for a little while before fading away. Other than that, they released an animated spin-off of Happy Days, updates of the Flintstones, which also got a pair of primetime specials this year, Scooby-Doo and Richie Rich, and the Super Friends, as well as packaging all of their late 60s action series into a new programming block called the World of Super Adventure. Even their new live-action efforts didn't amount to much this year, with the release of the last after-school special the studio would produce and a nearly forgotten TV movie called Belle Starr. This somewhat reduced output, as well as the rise and expansion of several other animation studios like Marvel Productions, DiC, and Saban Entertainment, didn't really bode well for the studio, and the decade kicked off with a significant reduction in their market share. Especially when coupled with the fact that the studio lost or ended a couple lines of business at the same time, producing their final title sequence for the 1980 Popeye series and having ended their work in industrial films the previous year. Looking to stem that shift in viewer dynamics, Hanna-Barbera parent company Taft purchased Ruby Spears in 1981, bringing Joe Ruby and Ken Spears back to working with the company they'd originally come from as a sister studio, and leading to the creation of several shared series between the two. Unfortunately for Hanna and Barbera, this also led them to having less immediate control over their productions, and coupled with the expanded network oversight, meant a somewhat frustrating year for them. It also meant that the studio had even less output than in the previous year, with only 5 new shows hitting airways, 4 of which didn't last beyond a single season. Quickie Koala and Trollkins were both new properties, with Quickie even being one of the last series animation legend Tex Avery worked on before his death, but even that couldn't keep the show on past 16 episodes. The other 2 single-season releases from the year were Space Stars, a show primarily featuring classic HB sci-fi characters, and an animated version of 70s sitcom Laverne and Shirley. However, the year also saw the release of the most successful, longest-running series in Hanna-Barbera's long and storied history with the acquisition of the license for the Smurfs from Belgian artist Peyo. The original series ran the length of the decade, remaining a staple of Saturday mornings until December of 1989 and totaling 258 episodes with a handful of specials, including one on primetime this year. There was also a live-action production in the form of a television special called The Great Gilly Hopkins and an animated special called The Fantastic World of Hanna-Barbera Arena Show, which later in the decade would see its title reused for a new programming block. Lastly, the final episode in the famous Classic Tales series came out of the Australian branch with a story based on frontiersman Daniel Boone. But the output from their other lines of business even slowed down as well, with the studio only producing a single PSA commercial and a few entries in their educational Learning Tree film strip series. It was the lightest production year in Hanna-Barbera history, but it was still significantly off their peak. Here's a couple of graphs, because I'm a nerd. At this point, both Bill and Joe were in their 70s, having been born in 1910 and 1911 respectively, and it's fairly easy to see here that this is the point where the studio begins what turns out to be an overall downward trend in new releases. Unlike the bounce back after the sharp dip in 1975, though, this trend continues decreasing until the studio buyout in 1996. We see occasional upticks now and then, with the first coming in 1985, but in 82 through 84 the studio continued releasing mostly licensed series and new takes on old characters, including more Flintstones, more Scooby, and animated versions of Gary Coleman, Dukes of Hazzard, and other popular properties of the era. They didn't really create anything new during this period, instead adapting a multitude of sources into animation. These included greeting cards in the form of the Shirt Tales, video games in the form of Pac-Man, toys in the form of Monchichis, comics in the form of Lucky Luke, and even puzzles in the form of Rubik the Amazing Cube. Of those, Pac-Man was probably the most important as it served as the proof of concept for the success of video games as cartoons. They did also catch on to the early presence of the anime trend, though, taking inspiration from the Japanese Machine Robo series and releasing a heavily Americanized version as Challenge of the GoBots. Though it hit the airwaves first on September 8, 1984, more than a week before the Transformers' September 17th premiere, it was only a comparatively moderate success, which can be said for most of their releases at the time, very few of which got more than a 13-episode season. Their underwater take on the Smurfs series, the Snorks, was the one exception here, running for 65 episodes through 1989. As for their other content of the time, there were a pair of miniseries with The Secret World of Og in 1983 and The Amazing Bungie Venture in 1984, both produced as ABC weekend specials, and a live-action one released exclusively in Australia called Return to Eden. They closed out the series of educational film strips in 1982 and only produced a single other educational video in this time frame about earthquake safety for the city of Los Angeles. A pair of commercials, one for Smurfberry Crunch and the other for the Shriners Hospital, as well as an animated theatrical film with Heidi's Song, which only made $5.1 million at the box office on a $9 million budget, capped off Hanna-Barbera's total output between 1982 and 84. As I pointed out on the graphs, though, there was a decent spike in 1985, specifically with a 50% increase in the number of new series released, though only a 25% in total production across all lines of business year over year. The most notable event for the studio in 1985 was probably the release of The Fantastic World of Hanna-Barbera as what was initially a 90-minute syndicated programming block that expanded to 2 hours the following year, and became a TV staple for nearly a decade. The block served as a launching and test platform for several new series over its run, starting off here with the medieval sword and sorcery series Galtar and the Golden Lance, the latest in small woodland creatures with the Pawpaws, and a new format for the studio's primary mascot with Yogi's Treasure Hunt, all of which was packaged with interstitials called HBTV featuring suited mascot characters engaged in various skits. We also saw what, at this point, had become an almost yearly tradition with not one, but 2 new Scooby series, the 7th and final entry in the Super Friends series, and more adaptations with the Berenstain Bears and CBS Story Break. Work with the ABC Weekend Specials also continued this year with a 2-episode sequel to last year's Bungie Venture and an animated version of children's classic The Velveteen Rabbit. That was it, though, with no commercials or educational output and nothing released to theaters. New series output dropped back down to 1984 levels this next year, but overall production saw another small increase. 2 of their new series were new IPs, with the short-lived Wildfire and slightly longer-lasting Foofer. This year's lineup was rounded out by an update to the 60s adventure series Johnny Quest, a bandwag-jumping infantilized series in the vein of Muppet Babies with the Flintstone Kids, and animated versions of the movie Teen Wolf and the Pound Puppies toy line. Most of the focus for this year seems to have been on other projects, though. Leading the charge back toward a diversified output was the studio's first foray into the burgeoning direct-to-video market with a series called The Greatest Adventure, Stories from the Bible. Each of these were single episode-length adaptations released individually on VHS, with the first 6 of the 13-video run coming this year alone. 1986 also brought a trio of live-action TV releases, with the 2-episode drama The Last Frontier and the Australian TV movie Shark's Paradise, which was a spoof dealing with the hostile nature of Australian wildlife. By this point, the studio is leaning even more heavily into the use of digital animation as well, making their releases more detailed and fluid than those seen in earlier years. Though digital pioneer Mark Lavoie had left the studio in 1983, the techniques and processes he'd developed were being applied to more than a third of Hanna-Barbera's output. A clear example can be seen in the studio's only theatrical release of the year, a feature-length GoBots production called Battle of the Rock Lords. This, unfortunately, much like Heidi's song, was not a success. On a more dour note, this year also saw the production of the final voice work by one of the studio's most iconic actors, Dawes Butler, the original voice of Yogi Bear, Quick Draw McGraw, and a whole laundry list of others. He would retire this year and unfortunately pass away 2 years later in 1988, with 399 acting credits to his name, the majority of which were in Hanna-Barbera cartoons. And just as devastating in terms of a loss of talent for the studio, longtime in-house composer Hoyt Curtin also retired this year. It wasn't the best year for the studio in general. 1987 saw the overall output drop more than 25%, with only a pair of new shows hitting the air, both of which were single-season, one-and-done series. The first was yet another Popeye cartoon with Popeye and Son. This was a co-production with King Features Entertainment, possibly due to their existing relationship, as Hanna-Barbera had created the title sequence for the later seasons of the all-new Popeye Hour in 1980. The other new series they brought to the world is admittedly one of my absolute favorites from the company, and probably something of a guilty pleasure in that regard. Sky Commanders was a new toy IP from Kenner that HB made the cartoon tie-in for. This was the 80s after all, and toys demanded tunes. The series was about a team of specially trained mountaineers, protecting a newly emerged island in the Pacific Ocean from a similarly equipped line of villains, kind of a G.I. Joe on ziplines. Unfortunately, both this and Popeye only got 13 episodes each, but Sky Commanders did mark yet another joint effort with a Japanese studio, this time with Toei Animation. That wasn't the only Hanna-Barbera Japan interaction this year either, as the studio also joined forces with Subaraya Productions to release the latest theatrical entry in the Ultraman series, known here in the States as either Ultraman, The Adventure Begins, or more commonly as Ultraman USA.
Strike that. Reverse it. This way, please!
Well, theatrical in Japan at least, since here it ended up as a TV movie, initially to serve as the pilot for a new Ultraman animated series, but those plans fell through during production. The studio did release several television specials this year, most of which featured their classic stable of characters, but there were two that stood out as unique amongst the others. One of these was a Christmas special funded by a religious organization called the Little Troll Prince. The special was called the Little Troll Prince, not the organization, which I'll admit to never having heard of as far as I can remember. As an 8-year-old at the time, I can't imagine I didn't see it, but it's a blank to me. The other special that I wanted to give, well, special mention, I guess, to, had the feel of a more family-friendly Ralph Bakshi work. Not very much more family-friendly, but a little. Rock Odyssey told the story of a decade-spanning relationship as it evolves and changed with the music of the eras it traverses. The movie is almost completely dialogue-free, other than the distinctive voice of the narrator, a sentient jukebox given life by Dick Halloran himself, Scatman Crothers, in his final credit before his death in November of 1986. The film was released after he'd already passed away, meaning he never got to see the finished product hit the air. We should all feel pretty lucky that any of us get to see it though, as it was almost never released, sitting on a shelf collecting dust between being completed in 1981 and finally airing this year, and even then only at the LA International Animation Celebration. The American English version of the special was actually lost media for more than 3 decades, only recently having seen its full English version reappear thanks to the efforts of amateur animation historians who released it online in 2023. If you haven't seen it, and you likely haven't, check it out. It's relatively easy to find around the interwebs. Rounding out the year, though, was the release of another direct-to-video entry in their Greatest Stories of the Bible series, and, well, that's about it. Oh, wait. They also began releasing a second direct-to-video, but also syndicated series called Hanna-Barbera Superstars 10. These 10 feature-length stories of their most iconic characters saw its first 4 entries hitting shelves/airways before December 31st. By the end of the year, though, the studio changed ownership from Taft Productions to the Great American Communication Group, which was essentially a restructured Taft following a hostile takeover by their majority shareholders. Hanna-Barbera, though, saw its internal management given an injection of young blood with the appointment of new president and CEO, David Kirshner, who was only 35 at the time, under Great American's restructuring. Prior to this year, Hanna-Barbera had relied heavily on the licensing of their characters to boost profits, but the studio had another small bump in output in 1988. One issue that I did notice this year was that their declining releases were paired with the fact that the studio hadn't had a series that ran for more than 2 seasons since the Snorks in 1984. That and the Smurfs were the only 2 legacy properties that were still airing at the start of the 1988 programming season, making for a notably smaller presence on the ever-expanding lineup of channels of the time. In fact, their share of the kids' TV market was only 20% by this point, lower than it had ever been. So, though still fewer releases than almost any other year from the decade so far, the studio put out 5 new series and under Kirshner started to focus on properties that were more marketable to modern kids, though we really wouldn't see that output starting for a couple of years. Here, though, the company paired with Callisto Limited on that studio's Fantastic Max series and comedian Martin Short to animate his Ed Grimley character, both of which were new IPs and fairly different from most of the earlier Hanna-Barbera output. They also released a very short-lived live-action game show called Skedaddle this year, which only managed to air for 6 weeks and was something I never saw myself. There were also a couple of modernizations of classics, as was mostly an annual standard for the studio. This year it was Yogi and Scooby, again, who got the update treatment. Well, I say update, but Yogi was an official final season of the original 1961 series, making it more of an undate. The Scooby Gang, however, got the de-aging treatment and hit the air with an entirely new take in the form of a pup named Scooby-Doo. This is actually my favorite version of the show, but that may be due to the fact that being 11 at the time of its release made me the perfect target demographic. Again, though, none of these shows would last more than 2 seasons. I mean, technically Scooby lasted for 3, but 2 and 3 combined only totaled 14 episodes. As for additional productions, they released the last 6 films in their Superstars 10 series, an anti-drug special as part of the Just Say No campaign starring the Flintstone Kids, and another video in their Stories from the Bible. This was, spoiler alert, more than double what we're about to see as we end the decade. Oh, and on a separate note, Hanna-Barbera's Australian studio split from the company this year as well, buying itself out and becoming the Southern Star Group. 1989 brought with it 2 new series, both of which were new versions of older shows, 2 TV specials, and a Stories from the Bible entry. That's it, though. The new TV series were bear-heavy programming with updates to both Paddington Bear and Super Ted, both of which only squeaked out 13 episodes. Their TV specials included a celebration of the studio's 50th anniversary, a variety show hosted by Tony Danza and Annie Potts that featured several guest stars and a huge roster of classic Hanna-Barbera's characters, and an animated special of the comic strip Hagar the Horrible. Finally, we saw an educational special produced as part of the DARE campaign. As I pointed out in the 1989 episode of the Animated 80s, the decade ended with a significant whimper overall, and that definitely holds true for Hanna-Barbera, not only with their reduced output, but with both Smurfs and Snorks ending their runs this year as well. Worst of all, both for Hanna-Barbera and animation as a whole, Mel Blanc passed away this year, having continued to provide the voice of several Looney Tunes characters right up until his death, and his final work would hit theaters next year. Maybe the significant increase in productivity we see in the next decade will herald a return to form for the studio, though. Well, as I just alluded to, 1990 brought with it significantly more content from the studio, including 6 new shows that aired this season, all of which were co-productions with other studios. There were single seasons of an animated version of Bill and Ted that they produced with Orion Television before it was taken over by Deke for a second season. The Rick Moranis starring Gravedale High, made with NBC Productions, and Midnight Patrol Adventures in the Dream Zone, which they did with a British producer called Sleepy Kids plc for broadcast as part of the Fantastic World and the BBC simultaneously. There were also the first of 2 seasons of The Adventures of Don Quixote and Sancho Panda, made in partnership with Radio Televisione Italiana, airing first in Italy before coming stateside as yet another component of the Fantastic World, and the first of 2 seasons for the live-action animated anthology combination Wake, Rattle, and Roll, which included an updated version of Wacky Races called the Fender Bender 500, and the highly marketable Monster Tales, animal versions of Universal Classic Monsters. Hanna-Barbera did have one decently big hit this year under Kirshner's new direction. This was another de-aging of classics with Tom and Jerry Kids, which ran for 65 episodes across 4 seasons and was a co-production with Turner Entertainment, who are the current owners of the franchise. There was also an animated special co-produced with Hallmark Greeting Cards called The Yum Yums, The Day Things Went Sour, starring Bart Simpson, and a trio of what would be the studio's final live-action specials with a pair of failed pilots called Where's Rodney and Puchinsky, rounded out by a biopic about Wizard of Oz author Frank L. Baum. The first commercial the studio had produced since 1984 aired this year for Jetsons cereal, which launched in support of the theatrical Jetsons movie that came out this year as well, and was the first theatrical release to prove profitable for the studio since, well, sometime in the early 70s, Maybe Charlotte's Web in 1973? There's not much information on either Baxter or Chomps, but I can't imagine either was a huge success. And lastly for the year, speaking of co-productions with Hallmark, a new direct-to-video series of classic fairy tales was released. Under the title of Timeless Tales with Hallmark, 8 videos were produced, with 6 hitting this year and 2 next. The following year would see Hanna-Barbera change ownership again, this time bought for $320 million by the Turner Broadcasting System and Apollo Global, who shared ownership 50-50. That is, at least until 1993, when Turner gained sole ownership by buying out Apollo's shares for an additional $225 million. Turner had acquired the studio in support of their soon-to-be-launched all-animation channel, Cartoon Network. The purchase of Hanna-Barbera gave them access to a huge repository of existing cartoons they'd be able to fill programming lineups with. In fact, according to referenceforbusiness.com, the purchase gave them approximately a third of the cartoons that existed at the time, a total of about 3,000 half-hour episodes. With new ownership also came new leadership, and Kirshner was replaced by Fred Siebert, who would helm the company through 1996 and beyond. As this was another shakeup for the studio, though, 1991 and 92 both saw output decrease, with 3 new series released in each of those years. During this period, we got 2 seasons of The Pirates of Darkwater, an awesome Kirshner-created show that ended on a cliffhanger well before its time, a season of Yo Yogi, which de-aged the characters and put them in high school, and a couple of seasons of Young Robin Hood, co-produced with French studio Cinar. The half-season-long Fish Police and a single season of Capital Critters, both of which were failed attempts to appeal to an older audience, and finally an updated version of the Addams Family riding the coattails of the hit live-action movie from the previous year, which was, in my opinion, a lot better than the show. 91 also saw the release of a Flintstones documentary called A Page Right Out of History, and a live-action special called The Last Halloween with CGI effects by Industrial Light and Magic, followed in 92 by a single animated special based on the Monster in My Pocket toy line, marking the studio's last contribution to the ABC weekend specials. Rounding out the content over these 2 years were the aforementioned final 2 parts of the Timeless Tales with Hallmark series and a video about the importance of education for the humanitarian agency UNICEF. The studio in this mostly classical incarnation would have one final surge in 1993, but it wasn't a major one in any real sense. They released 4 new series, consisting of one starring their classic character Droopy the dog, a new comedy called Two Stupid Dogs, which featured shorts of another classic character with Secret Squirrel, my personal favorite from maybe the whole lifetime of the studio's output with SWAT Cats, and a variety series called The Moxie Show. The last one was something of a milestone, as it was the first series the studio produced specifically for Cartoon Network, which would set a precedent for things to come. The year also brought several specials, with the Johnny Quest TV movie, a pair of them starring the Flintstones, and a trio of holiday-themed releases. But then there was 1994, a unique year in the studio's history since they didn't release a single new series, although they did take over production of Captain Planet from Deke. Instead, they limited themselves to a quartet of animated specials. On the theatrical side, though, Hanna-Barbera released the biggest and most successful movie in their history with the live-action adaptation of The Flintstones. Produced in collaboration with Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment and featuring John Goodman as Fred and Rick Moranis as Barney, with a cover of the theme song by the B-52s, the film grossed $340 million on a budget of $46. Not bad when stacked up against the year's animation output. And that brings us to 1995 and 96, and the end of an animation era when Turner Broadcasting would end up being absorbed by Warner Brothers. The Hanna-Barbera name would linger on for a few more years after the acquisition, but the Hanna-Barbera that we'd known since the late 50s would be essentially gone. So what did we get to remember them by? Honestly, nothing that makes you think Hanna-Barbera. Instead, these last couple of years gave us what kind of feels like something from a studio that could already sense which way the wind was blowing. We got a single season of an animated Dumb and Dumber in 1995, and new versions of Johnny Quest and the Flintstones in 96. Of the latter 96 series, the first was typically 90s extreme and featured some of the worst CGI monstrosities of the decade, and the second was barely animated and barely scripted for the preschool crowd. The Johnny Quest computer travesty, of which the traditionally animated portions were actually pretty good, to be fair, also got a TV movie with Johnny Quest versus the Cyber Insects. Last but not least, or maybe least, depending on your point of view, since it certainly wasn't most, was an animated version of the Dr. Seuss story Daisy Head Maisie. I'd thought I was familiar with most Dr. Seuss books, having had a collection of some myself as a child and getting several for my own kids, not to mention working in an actual bookstore all the way through college, but researching this video was the first I'd actually ever heard of this particular story. It did have Tim Curry,
Space!
Jonathan Winters, and Scarlett herself, B.J. Ward, doing voices though, so that's something, I guess.
That's all, folks.
But honestly, that's pretty much the end of the story for the Hanna-Barbera most of us would prefer to remember. The merger with Time Warner nearly gutted what remained of the original studio, shutting down the physical locations where so many classics had been created and moving the teams into their LA high-rise, not to mention shifting them to producing content almost exclusively for the fledgling Cartoon Network, where eventually they'd be completely assimilated into Cartoon Network studios. I do have to say, though, that maybe it's fitting the studio Joe and Bill had built from scratch shut down, as William Hanna died in 2001, followed by Joseph Barbera 5 years later in 2006, and as the pair had been the driving force behind much of the legacy the studio created and would leave behind. In most ways, it wouldn't have felt right without them. So that's where I'm going to end this first studio retrospective series. Thanks for being patient waiting on this one, and who knows, I may look further at the Cartoon Network studio years at some point in the future. For now, though, I'm narrowing my focus to pre-2000, as that's the time that means the most to me personally. So the next one of these retros will be from another big name in that period. I don't know, maybe Filmation or Ruby Spears, but you guys can let me know if you have any preferences in the comments. I'm also planning to start up the animated 70s here in the near future, but first I want to continue with another of my series that hasn't seen an entry in a while, the animated 80s Japan edition, especially since it's been an outstanding request for a long time now. You can look for the 1982 episode of that in the very near future, as well as more entries in the personnel office, deep dives, and whatever shiny object catches my attention at any given moment. I've also got some other things in the pipeline that I finally have the time and fortitude to get moving on, so more about those soon as well. Anyway, share your thoughts and memories about your Hanna-Barbera favorites in the comments, and let me know how you liked this video and the series overall. Thanks for watching, everyone. Stay tuned, and stay tuned, as in cartoons. Later.